Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore archetypal psychology. This is part one in a three-part series. With me is Dr. Jean Shinoda Bolen, clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California Medical Center in San Francisco. Dr. Bolen is the author of numerous books, including Goddesses in Every Woman, Gods in Every Man, The Ring of Power, and the Tao of Psychology. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. In your book, The Tao of Psychology, you look at the principle of synchronicity that was developed by Carl Jung, and one of the things that you point out is that this is a way of understanding the universe that is familiar to ancient Chinese culture and to Eastern cultures in general.
And to all of us in everyday life as well.
Mm-hmm.
The Eastern saying, when the pupil is ready, the teacher will come, assumes that there's a relationship between what is inside of us and what happens in the world. And I think all of us have had that experience. We might have a dream of someone we haven't thought of for a long time, and the next day we might run into them. And we might have the experience of shivers up the spine as we have because synchronicities do that. When there's a synchronistic event, it's a meaningful coincidence. Actually, Carl Jung didn't develop the notion. He just put a name on a phenomenon that we're all familiar with, which is that eerie sense of there's some coincidence that is meaningful to us between an event and inside of us and an event outside of us. It's not the same as synchronous, which means two simultaneously occurring events. It's that there is a synchronicity, there is a connection, a meaningful one, meaning that there has to be a human being that puts meaning on the feeling inside and the event outside.
When these happen in my life, it suggests to me that there's really a connection. It's as if inside and outside aren't so different.
That certainly does seem to be the case. Mm-hmm. That is, that when you have a sense of readiness inside for an experience, an openness, for example, where there was once resistance, how very often then something happens that corresponds to that.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you point out is, although these are familiar experiences, almost everybody has had them, that Western culture has developed along different lines. We tend to think that mind and matter are quite separate from each other and that one's inner state couldn't possibly influence events.
Well, that's because we so favor left brain thinking, which is causal, and synchronicity has no cause and effect. You cannot prove how one thing connects with the other, except that at a level of meaning they do.
Mm-hmm. Jung referred to it as an acausal
connecting principle.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea between an acausal connecting principle is what makes many of the oracle kinds of ways of having a connection between the person who asks a question and some kind of way of getting a response, for example.
Like the I Ching.
Like the I Ching, specifically, is one good example where it makes absolutely no causal, reasonable, rational connection between if you throw 3 coins 6 times and then look up the results in a book, that whatever you find in the book would have anything to do with where you are.
Mm-hmm. And virtually all divination systems work along a similar principle. You throw the bones or the sticks, or you look at the entrails of a goat or something, and out of that you're supposed to get meaningful information.
Well, sometimes I think that when you look at things like entrails of a goat, perhaps someplace there's maybe an overlay between someone doing a projective reading
Mm-hmm.
and a more specific synchronistic connection between what you are,
Mm-hmm.
where you are, and what the reading might show.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I recall, it was in response to Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching that Jung, Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, and I suppose the founder of archetypal psychology, developed or first wrote about the notion of synchronicity.
Well, he had actually lectured about it a little before then, and he said that it's something that he had been observing for about 30 years before when he was asked to write the introduction to the I Ching. He did by throwing it himself,
Mm-hmm.
or rather by doing a yarrow stick.
Which is one of the systems
One
for
of the-
working
right.
with this Chinese oracle.
And then what he had is that the oracle spoke for itself.
Mm-hmm.
I found often that when I speak to, like, departments of psychiatry, that I have to begin with the notion of right and left brain thinking. Otherwise, it makes no sense. That the right brain has the ability to experience a totality experience and can hold many different notions at the same time and see the relationship between them instead of having a definite cause and effect kind of a thing. So that in order to appreciate synchronicity, you really have to suspend your left brain in order to have the experience.
Mm-hmm.
A haiku poet named R.H. Bly spoke of the left brain by saying that it's a wonderful instrument to understand certain things, but it can understand anything of which God is not. That is, it's related to the ego's capacity to understand something.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that is greater than the ego's ability to grasp, that we subjectively, for example, experience in an intuitive feeling way, is beyond the left brain's experience.
And these are the things that you and many people refer to when you use the word the Tao.
The Tao, or the notion of the self. One of the things about Jung that I appreciate as a theoretician is that his use of language to explain a myriad of things is very helpful. So you have something that he would call the archetype of the self, a large S self. And within that is everything that we experience from the ego standpoint that is spiritually informative, greater than our ego's capacity to know. So whether you call it God or goddess or higher power or the Tao, the Eastern notion of the Tao is that we are related to, it's the underlying invisible matrix to which everything in the universe is related.
Mm-hmm.
So that when you have an experience at times of synchronicity, and there's a connection between something I feel and an event that happens outside of me, at that moment there is an experience of the self, meaning that at that moment there's a sense of illumination, a sense that I have a place in this universe, I have a sense of meaning, that I have a sense of being connected rather than being just an isolated, single, separate, and often lonely person.
Mm-hmm. It's a very crucial experience.
Which most of us have had.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, most people have it often before they get overly intellectual, educated, and that kind of a thing. In fact, many people will remember having it somewhere in their years between, say, 6 and 7 and maybe 15 or 16,
Mm-hmm.
when there's an openness,
Yeah.
when there's a... I appreciated the author Frederick Frank when he was talking about his experience of the Tao. And he spoke about walking along a country road when he heard and saw the snow falling. And something occurred in his experience He said, I heard the snow falling with the softest hissing sound, and suddenly I knew that everything out there was in me. And that was the connection of the Tao. For me, and that was also an introvert's sense, that everything outside is experienced as being inside. For the extrovert, it's like having a sense of connecting with everything out there. So my own experience at about the same age, which would be about 8 or 9, something like that, was being up in the mountains looking at the starry skies, night after night, falling asleep, watching, experiencing the stars. And you know, we all know that is an amazing experience of beauty.
Yeah.
But at some point, as a child, something switched in that I wasn't just looking at the stars, but that I had an experience that all that beauty, all that grandeur that was the universe, that I was connected to it, and I had a place. And that moment, that connection, is what Jung would call the archetype of the self. When you have that intuitive feeling sense of this greater connection.
Jung used the word, I believe, circumambulate to describe the connection with the self. It's something you kind of dance around rather than try and penetrate logically.
Well, if something is much greater than the instrument that can pick it up, meaning the ego, you can't take it all in. You can't get far enough back to see the whole thing. You just get experiences in which you get parts of it. And so circumambulation, which means going around something, is an experience in which you go around something larger than your capacity to know, and you get pieces of it. I use the metaphor of when NASA sent out the Venus probes, that it took pictures of the planet as the probe went around it, and only afterwards could you put some of them together to get something of a picture. But the probe itself, like the ego, could only grasp sections of it at a time, which is usually our experience.
In other words, what you're saying is that our experience of who we are isn't so different from perhaps the Venus probe going around the planet, and maybe sometimes it would think that it confuses itself with the whole planet.
Or that what it's seeing is the totality of reality. It's more like that.
Right, like one little snapshot is
Right,
all of
is
Venus.
all it is, right.
Yeah. Jung himself had an unusual synchronicity that opened up his whole understanding of the archetype of the self. Isn't that true?
Well, I think he has had experiences of synchronicity all along. In fact, I think that one of the best ways to understand synchronicity is to just track his own experiences. For example, he was describing a time when he was walking in the woods with a woman who was telling him a dream that was the most significant dream of her experience. And so you can imagine, here they are in the woods, they're walking along, and she's taking the opportunity to explain a dream to Dr. Jung. And she said that it occurred in her childhood home, which had a large spiral staircase. And she was at the foot of it, and she was looking up the staircase, and down the spiral staircase she suddenly saw a ghostly fox. And at that moment, Jung said, a real fox stepped out of the woods and walked with them for a while. And he described this incident in a letter to J.B. Rhine, who is a father of ESP, and described this as an experience of synchronicity, because the coincidental event was between this very significant dream and that particular moment. And unless you felt it, there would be no connection.
Yeah.
Unlike while Rhine, in his research, was doing statistically significant, very different kinds of
card guessing experiments at Duke University in the 1930s through the 60s.
Right. So that was one example that Jung described. And then he was himself talking about another event that happened to him when he was awakened with a headache, which was unusual for him. And then after he awoke, he had the sense that there was a presence in the room. And at this point, he was far from home. He had gone to give a lecture in a foreign city, and so he was in a hotel room. So he got up and tried the door and found that there was nobody there. And then he tried to reconstruct what woke him up, and that's when he recalled that it was a particular kind of a headache, and that he felt a strong sense of a headache that was now sort of a dull pain in the back of his head, and it was a certain time in the middle of the night. Well, as far as he was concerned, at that moment, there wasn't anything. It was just strange, so he went back to bed. And then when he went back to Zurich, he found that during that night, at that time, a patient of his had shot himself in the forehead, and the bullet had come to lodge in the back of his head. Mm. And so he described that as a synchronicity that was not only a meaningful coincidence, but said something about how there was a link between the two people as well, which, as you know, is when more ESP experiences occur between...
When there's an emotional connection,
yes,
which of course psychotherapists form with their clients, or parents with their children. They're more telepathic kinds of experiences.
Especially when a significant, often death, risk, really a strong affect experience is felt by one person, experienced by one person, and the ESP receiver gets some form of it.
One of the things that you have written is that when archetypes are activated with a lot of emotional energy, synchronicities seem to occur more often.
Well, archetypal experiences are those experiences that are generic in a sense, that they are common to all of us, and then we give a particular personal quality to it. But whenever we are present at an archetypal experience or feel one, it's like this is what we have in common with all of humankind. So, for example, falling in love is an archetypal experience. The particular person and why you are drawn to that particular person may be highly personal, but when you are in the midst of the experience, there is a personal and then there is a transpersonal or collective unconscious element. And so you feel the depth of it and the mystery of it, and you're drawn into an experience that's, again, bigger than the ego's. And the ego is affected by it. Sometimes when you are caught by an archetypal experience, it feels like you're possessed by it, which falling in love is. Sometimes it's connected with a particular story, often, because it is common to us to tell stories about experiences that we all share. And so, for example, one of the least pleasant experiences would be jealousy at being the spurned woman. And this is a story of the goddess Hera and her jealousy because she's married to Zeus, who is a philanderer. And over again, her reaction to it is to become jealous and enraged and vindictive. And a person, male or female, who is possessed by Hera may be fine until there is that hint that says infidelity might be happening. And then suddenly this fairly rational person, ordinarily rational person, finds herself possessed by obsessive ideas, by jealousy, and by a vindictive rage. And if she is somebody who knows that this is not who she wants to be, that she doesn't want to be this kind of person that acts this way, she feels, in fact, taken over or possessed by an archetypal experience or an archetype. And so that would be a very common experience. Or a man in power.
Well, is it likely that, let's say, the Hera archetype is invoked, that the woman involved may be getting genuine telepathic or synchronistic impressions of her husband or partner engaged in some affair?
She may very well. As well as the intuitive feeling picking up on that something's going on with him. We do pick up an awful lot
Yeah.
from each other. We do know and
Mhm.
read each other's experience actually quite well.
Mhm. Now, we were talking earlier about the self in the Jungian sense being this larger part of us that connects us with the universe. That's also an archetype, isn't it?
Yes, it's the archetype of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And it is what gives us a sense that we have a purpose here, that we have a soul, that we are in a meaningful universe. All of that has to do with the archetype of the self, which, from as far as we can gather, humankind has had a sense of divinity, for example, as an archetypal experience that goes way back. It may change in form so that we might have historically a goddess for 25,000 years, and then 5,000 years ago the major divinity may turn out to now be a father god. But the sense that there is a divinity to which we are related, that's the archetypal experience.
Yeah. Earlier, when I was mentioning the synchronicity that Jung had that affected his understanding of the self, I was thinking of his work in the development of the mandala and the painting that he was doing of the mandala with the castle in the center as being an image that was bubbling up from his own psyche, and it became his image of what the self was all about.
And he was painting it, and then he gets in the mail a book from Richard Wilhelm called The Secret of the Golden Flower, where these Taoists of several, I think a thousand years before, was describing something very similarly to and so he had that uncanny experience of being, for one thing, validated, that he's not working on something totally idiosyncratically his own.
Yeah. Which was quite important for him at that time.
Yes, because he was isolated in his work. He had broken with Freud, and he was going into the sort of far-out areas, which he had a propensity to do, which took him, and when I say far out, that he moved out of like left brain experience a lot. And his work on synchronicity is something that he didn't publish for about 30 years for that reason. And when he did, he made, he has in his collected works a very readable short essay called On Synchronicity. And then, because he felt probably defensive about how he was going to present this notion, which wasn't rational, acausal, he then spent another couple of years and wrote a much less readable, in my opinion, longer, definitive work called Synchronicity and Acausal Connecting Principle, in which he incorporated a whole research project on astrology.
Well, it seems to me that when we talk about Jung struggling to develop his own psychology, to break free of Freud's influence, and working in this strange mythological area with archetypal images, or with mandala images, with drawings and so on, and then suddenly finding the confirmation of his own thinking in an ancient Chinese text, that this is the embodiment of the statement that you began our interview with when you said, when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Yes, that's true. And the mandala, which is basically a form in which there's a circle inside of a square. And in many of the Tibetans' works, you see that same image. And it is an image that when you are centered, you have the experience of the ego as being in touch, or being, what we would say more technically, an ego-self axis. The ego is related to the archetype of the self.
The ego-self axis.
Basically, Jung's notion of the structure of the psyche would be the ego, like everybody else's notion of the ego, that this is the chief executive officer in us that makes decisions, that perceives, that has access to our memories and our education and things like this. And then he would describe that we have two directions in which we could go. One, towards the outer world, in which we are concerned with how we appear in the outer world, and that is we put on a persona, which is how we appear in the world, how we're dressed, how we speak, how we're perceived, all the energy that people go into when they're concerned about their image.
Yeah.
That's being invested in the persona.
Sometimes that word means the mask.
It came from the word mask, from the Greek word for the persona that the actors wore on stage. So when you saw the mask worn, you knew immediately who that person was. And we have to do that too. If you're going to be an executive, you better show up in a suit, for example, if you're going to pass for one. And a lot of effort goes into often having an adequate persona, but it takes a lot of energy to be in a persona. Whereas if your ego is relating to the archetype of the self, it's like from the self comes a great deal of centering energy. There is a sense of security, a sense of having a place. Say, if you're a Taoist, you'd say, I have a sense of having a place in the universe. If you're a Christian, you would say, I have a sense of being connected to Jesus. But it's that connection with something greater than yourself that gives you a place in this world, that makes it, and makes your life feel meaningful. That's what it's like when the ego is in touch with the self. But the self has many different names.
Well, and synchronicity, it would seem, is the vehicle whereby our egos can open up to that powerful archetype of the self.
Often, because at that moment you get a glimpse into something greater than yourself.
Jean Shinoda Bolen, it's been a pleasure being with you. Our time is up now. Thanks so much for being with me.
You're very welcome. It went very fast.
Yes. And thank you for being with us. You've been listening to part 1 of a 3-part series on archetypal psychology. We've been focusing on synchronicity and the self. Please tune in again for parts 2 and parts 3 about the archetypes, the deities, and family relationships. Thank you.